Hey there, this is going to be my first attempt at recording a video. Had several people ask for me to do videos over things that we didn't get to in class, and the first one is motivation. So today we're real quickly going to go over Motivational Concepts, which is Module 37. Um, basically, just kind of come up with a definition of motivation, and at the end you should be able to identify several of the theories of motivated behavior. So when we talk about motivation, the question is, what is it? It's something that's really hard to kind of define. We can see behavior, we can observe behavior, but motivation is the tricky part. Why are you here? Why are you watching this video? You could have a lot of different reasons. Maybe your parents are saying you need to spend some time on school stuff. Some of you may be wanting to try to get those last few concepts in so that you can do well on the AP test. Same thing with class. Typically there's 25 or 29 other students in our AP Psych class with you. Y'all are all doing the same thing. You're all in class, but the motivation for each person is different. So I always like to start off one story to kick off this unit, which is Alan Ralston. He was a young man who liked to go out into the wilderness, liked to go hiking, mountain biking. If you've seen the movie 127 Hours, that's the story of what happened to him. He made a few mistakes. One was not really being clear on letting people know where he was going, that he was heading out, which is kind of a rule of going out in the wilderness, leaving details with friends and family. And in the course of his hiking, he got trapped by a rock. Kind of fell down into this canyon. A rock came loose and pinned his arm between the rock wall and the boulder, and he could not get his arm out. So he is stuck there, and I think he is actually the best person to kind of tell that story. So I'm going to go ahead and play that clip like I usually do.
In the canyon, Ralston was once again idly chipping away at the rock when his knife brushed the tip of his thumb.
It ripped part of the skin off of my thumb, kind of like the way an old blister will rip away. And so that made me curious, and I started prodding around, and I stuck the knife down in and at my thumb at that spot, and it slid in like I was sliding it into a pat of warm butter. And it went in, I couldn't feel it, of course, but it went in about a ½ inch, and then this hissing sound of gas, the decomposition gases releasing from inside my arm, my hand, where they'd been building up as my hand was decomposing over those 5 days. And that threw me into a panic. It scared me. It appalled me. It was a gruesome concept that my hand was decaying while still attached to my body, and I started yanking my hand, my arm, and I was giving it everything that I had, and was twisting myself around and trying to slide my arm up and down like this. And
then, in an instant, Ralston realized what he had to do to save his life.
It came to me, this epiphany, that I could break the bones, because my arm was caught so tightly that I could torque myself. The other bone.
Torque, a basic principle to a former engineer like Ralston. Remember, he had made an initial attempt to amputate his arm 2 days before, only to realize there was no way his pocket knife could slice through the bones. But if he could break them, maybe he'd have a chance. He would have to snap both of the bones in his arm to make it work.
And so I slammed my body against the opposite wall. I grabbed the backside of the boulder and even got my feet up to where I was standing halfway up the wall and grabbing the backside of the rock and humping my body over it until finally that bottom bone snapped. And this pow sound went kind of echoing through the canyon. And I don't even know if I started feeling excited at that point, but I just knew the next thing that I had to do was that I had to break the other bone. And so I grabbed the bottom side of the rock and pushed and tried to sink myself down until I was pushing up to create the downward leverage on the top bone until it too made the same noise, pow, and snapped in the same spot, thankfully, right where my wrist was caught. They both broke right along here, just behind the bones of my wrist.
But now you've got to cut off the arm.
Yeah, and I said to myself, here we go, Aaron, you're in it now. And I took my knife.
Its blades were now bent and dull from days of stabbing at the rock.
At first I still had the larger blade out, and I held it up against my arm, and I started pushing into it, and I couldn't get the knife to sink in, and so I switched over and I pulled out the smaller blade. And with the smaller blade then I actually started the amputation. The smaller one was still a little more sharp.
The smaller blade was just 2 inches long.
I just dove into this exercise, this surgical procedure, and started cutting away. And
he cut through the top layer of skin and muscle until he saw an artery. Only then did he realize he'd forgotten to apply the tourniquet he had fashioned days earlier from the insulated lining of his water bottle.
I put the tourniquet on, and I was bleeding down the wall, and I severed the artery. And
he cut through more muscle and 2 more arteries, then tendon, the most difficult layer. His dull knife was unable to cut through
it, so I ended up taking the pliers side of the knife and using that to grab and twist and rip until the tendon gave way.
It was slow, painful, excruciating work. He hacked away at his arm for nearly an hour, layer by layer, until he saw what he knew would cause the most intense pain yet.
And then I was looking at the nerve, this little strand of spaghetti running through my arm, and I had to take the knife and pry it up, and even when I touched it, it felt like the fire of sticking my arm into just a pot of liquid metal. It burned all the way up my arm, and I took it again and lifted it up. I knew it was going to hurt, and I plucked it up and did in a motion like that, and that fire sensation redoubled and went all the way up to my shoulder. But I knew that was the hard part.
It was only a few more moments of work
after that, and then boom, and I wasn't even attached anymore, and I fell down like this, and I was free.
You were reborn.
It was the happiest moment of my life, and it's funny to think about it being. There will never be a more powerful experience.
I always like to stop here to point out we've talked about memory, and we talked about state-dependent memory. If you're in the same state of mind as you were, it's easy to remember other events when you were in that same state of mind. We also talked about context-dependent memory. And I think you kind of got a sense of that right there. He's back in the same place where all this happened. And those details and those memories are being recalled to a higher degree than if he was just talking about this in the studio. I always kind of tell my story about the wilderness. This is the Yosemite Valley, Yosemite National Park. And in 2010, my wife and I took a trip there, and we hiked all the way from the valley floor back in this area, all the way to the top of this mountain. And in order to do that, you have to go up through this valley. It's a change in the elevation of 4,500 feet. It's 8 miles up and then 8 miles back. And it took basically 12 hours. I started like at 7 in the morning, and did not get back to the car until 7 at night. And every once in a while, I mean, it's one of the things I'm really proud of. It's one of those classic hikes that if you go there, you're supposed to do. This is the point at which you get down to the last 500 feet, and that's the very top of it. And right here, you can see those are people lined up to go up to the top. And it took us just going from here to the top took an hour. And then from here back down took an hour just navigating those cables. It's hard to tell from this angle, but it's like a 45-degree angle. And I'm really proud that we did it. And I look back, and every once in a while, I'm like, it wasn't that bad. We could do it again. But then memories come back, and I realize how terrible it was. It was just a constant hike, stepping up on like almost like a stairmaster the whole time. And the whole time we kept telling each other, well, it's got to be easier going down. And it was just as hard going down as it was going up. So the question is, why did we do it? And a lot of it has to do with competition I used to feel like I had to have with my brother. Him and his partner had gone, and they got to this point. They'd taken 2 days to get here. We did it all in one day, and they chickened out. They would not go that last bit. And so we kind of had this competition that we were doing hikes that they'd done, and we had to do them better. And we did it, but I learned from that, even though that was my motivation, that I didn't have to compete with him anymore. So everybody has motivations for different behaviors. This is like the top of the mountain there. But that's kind of what we're looking at today. Why do we have the behaviors that we have? So one of the theories is instinct theory, that it's a fixed pattern of behavior. It's something genetic. There's instincts in animals. There's instincts in human. One of the instincts in birds is they build a nest. It's part of survival. Humans have the need or the instinct to procreate. Um, you have other examples of animals with instinctual behavior. Um, Salmon returning to where they were born to spawn and start the cycle all over again. Birds flying south for the winter. Problem is that we can see the behavior. We know that birds fly south for the winter, but we can't observe the instinct. We can't understand that motivation. But it's something that's innate. It's something that you're born with, and it's something that you is genetic. It's kind of programmed. If we go back to that evolutionary psychology. The next one is drive and drive theory. So we've talked about homeostasis when we talked about the biological part of psychology, the need for your body to stay in a sense of balance. And that's where drive reduction theory comes in. You have a need for something. Your need, for example, some of your basic needs are food, water, stuff like that. Your drive is your desire to meet that need. Needs show that you're missing something to maintain that homeostasis. So if you are not getting water, if you have a need for water, then you're dehydrated. Your drive is to satisfy that need for water or rehydrate. So drive pushes you to some type of behavior to reduce that drive. So you're going to eat, you're going to drink. And this can explain a lot of things. And it's kind of going back to our conditioning, our Skinner operant conditioning. That's, one big thing that kind of fits in with everything. But it's very basic, it's very biological. So when we get to conditioning, you're really kind of dealing more with incentives. And this is where you start seeing things are getting to more of a higher psychological level. So when we're talking about that, we talked about with operant conditioning, um, positive, negative reinforcement, positive, negative punishment. Um, you remember when you were trying to condition a person or an animal, you had all those things that you did to do that. We see it in our school. Um, some of you probably with this break, this at-home learning, are kind of concerned about your grades. Some of you aren't concerned with grades. You're like happy that it's pass fail. Others are looking at, well, what about my GPA? So incentives are a little bit trickier because they're not the same for everybody, and the same thing is not going to motivate everybody. So another theory is arousal theory. So in order to want to do something or to do something well, you have to have the right amount of arousal. And if you remember our FRQ that we did when we came back from the break, the example was somebody that was preparing for a play. And when we talk about arousal, we're not talking about anything sexual. We're talking about um, excitement, like mental excitement, physical excitement, but not sexual type of thing. So the big theory here is the Yerkes-Dodson law, and it tries to explain things by why do we do things, why are we getting what we need. It goes beyond just the need to satisfy biological urges. Why do some people have curiosity? Um, some people are going to maybe watch the videos for AP Classroom, the AP College Board videos, and you're just going to take the notes. You're going to try to stick it in your head. But others are going to be aroused and have a natural curiosity to want to know more. It also gets into the whole thing of why some people are sensation seekers. Um, you're trying to um, satisfy or remove boredom. So that may be why we have some people that are adrenaline junkies. So if you have too little arousal, what happens is you are bored and you are not interested. If you have too much arousal, then you end up with anxiety, stress, almost that what we talked the sympathetic response where your body is going to go into panic mode. So with the Yerkes-Dodson theory, there is this zone that you want to be in where you are not too aroused to the point where you are stressed out and can't function, and you're not too unaroused and you are bored to the point that you don't want to do anything. So you're going to end up staying somewhere in here if you are reaching your maximal optimal performance. Now, there's one aspect of this that's kind of a little different, is that sometimes if the task is real easy, something easy to do, then having high arousal or stress put on you may make it easier for you to do that task. Something that you don't have to think about, something that is easy to do without a lot of concentration. The opposite is true. If it is a difficult task, it's helpful for the arousal to be low because then you can actually kind of focus on it. You don't feel the pressure. So that kind of goes back to our FRQ with the young woman that was preparing for the play. If she is too bored in her role in the play, then she may not devote the amount of time that she needs to learn her lines and perform well when she has the performance. If it's too high, then she may get so stressed out that she forgets her lines. So it's got to be somewhere in this optimal range. All right, and our last person you may have encountered in some of your other classes. I know that in child development they talk about it, and it is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so when you come across Maslow, it's a pretty basic theory, but it comes down to the humanistic theory that humans need to work towards fulfilling their potential, and that is this top part of the pyramid. But before you can get there, you have to meet all these other basic needs. So physiological needs are more important than safety needs. You have to satisfy your hunger and thirst, or you're not going to survive. Um, After you've met these needs, then you can worry about things like um, where you're going to spend the night, where you're going to live, housing, transportation. After that, you can start focusing on belongingness and love, the need to be loved, accepted, esteem, having other people recognize and respect you, and then finally the self-actualization needs. They sometimes break this up, and they will call these fundamental needs, and then these are psychological needs, and then you get to the self-actualization needs. One thing I always like to point out about self-actualization needs, I usually ask at this point for people in the class to think of who they think has met the point where they've are living up to their full and unique potential. They are all that they can be. The Army used to have a logo called, or a slogan called, "Be all you can be," and that's what they're talking about. You have reached your full potential. You're firing on all cylinders. You're accomplishing everything you were meant to be. And you are probably getting these things. You probably have love in your life. You're probably getting the respect and your esteem. But you're doing this because you are wanting to accomplish and succeed. And it's not about money, and it's no longer about getting recognition and respect. So I usually ask who those people in our society are, and I get people that will mention Bill Gates, Oprah, President Obama. And I always like to make that point. Let's take Bill Gates for a second. Obviously, people respect him for what he's accomplished in his life. He doesn't have to worry about his safety needs, obviously, because he's still one of the richest men in the world. But he has set himself on a path to try to give away the majority of his wealth. He's set up different foundations to help the world and help society, um, because he wants to, not because he feels like he has to, but because that helps him live up to meeting that unique potential. So just remember that this is not about money. It's not about esteem. It's kind of transcending that. This is just one I used to kind of show that's kind of fun. If you're a robot, this might be your hierarchy of needs. You have to have robot food for your physical needs, antivirus software, safety, um, vacuum living room belonging, become self-aware, self-esteem, and then destroy humans would be your self-actualization. If we'd done this lesson in class, I usually have you guys create your own hierarchy of needs for a person or a category of people or an object. Um, Somebody else did this one on different apps, and I thought it was kind of interesting, the ones that they picked. Physiological needs, you have to have a battery, you have to have Wi-Fi, you have to have a computer or a smart device, you have to have a connection. Safety needs, you've got Google Maps, your security, email. Belongingness and love, you've got your connection via messages and phone, Facebook. Steam, I thought this was kind of interesting because it's Snapchat, Twitter, and Instagram. With these apps, people are able to quantify what people think about them. So now, even with Facebook to some extent, but with these, you can post something and you can immediately realize what people think about it because you get those likes, you get those interactions. And the self-actualization needs. I mean, not a lot of us create our own YouTube channels, but if you're creating content, you're doing that for yourself and getting that information out there. So this is just a chart. It's in your book, but it kind of breaks everything down. The four main motivational theories: instinct theory, drive reduction, optimal arousal, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's all strengths and weaknesses for both. This will kind of deal with explaining those evolutionary psychology, but it does better with explaining animal behavior. Humans don't have a lot of actual instincts. Drive reduction explains our motivation based on some of these basic needs, but doesn't explain why some of these motivated behaviors increase arousal. And even though optimal arousal is getting closer to some of these deeper explanations, it's still not getting to some of these more complex social needs. So that's really getting into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but this is going to change in some circumstances. So I did want to go back and point out in closing that this has been one of the things that has been discussed as we've been going through the different phases of getting back to, or getting to the point of having online instruction. Wherever you are here, as far as your grades and your reasoning for wanting to do well in school, one discussion was we need to make sure that your physiological needs and some of your psychological needs were being met before we worried about grades and credits. If students are struggling and don't have what they need, if they're not getting fed, then they're not really going to really care about signing on to do lessons on the computer. So that was one of the reasons why Arlington ISD's focus really was making sure that meals to students that needed them were not interrupted. So anyway, I hope you've kind of enjoyed this video, and um, we will try another one pretty soon.